Beneath the frigid, desolate waters of the Baltic Sea, where sunlight fades, compasses fail, and machines lose their minds, something rests. It doesn't move, it doesn't breathe, but it's watching. It is perfectly circular, too perfect. As if it had been carved, not by wind or water, but by the deliberate hands of something ancient. Some say it's just a rock, others claim it's a craft from beyond the stars. But the strangest part, every time someone gets close, something goes wrong. Electronics die, signals vanish, engines stutter. It's as if the object doesn't want to be seen. Today, we'll dive nearly 300 feet below the surface to confront a mystery science still can't explain, one that defies geology, history, and reason itself. And if you're lucky, maybe the truth will surface before the end of this video. It began on a summer morning in 2011. A team of Swedish commercial divers, known as Ocean X, was conducting a routine sonar sweep along the Baltic Sea floor. They weren't looking for anything extraordinary, maybe a shipwreck, maybe a few bottles of vintage liquor. What they found instead was a perfect circle, roughly 200 feet wide, lying 300 feet below the surface. The sonar image was unmistakable. It was too round, too precise. Not a ship, not a rock, something else. Captain Peter Lindberg and his partner Dennis Asperg stared at the screen in disbelief. This wasn't just a random blip. Whatever it wasn't natural. They decided to investigate further. They deployed an ROV, a remotely operated vehicle, to descend into the cold, silty darkness. The monitor showed the descent, 60 meters, 70, then 80. Suddenly the screen flickered. The compass began spinning uncontrollably. The video feed is cut to black. Something was interfering, something powerful. But then, just as suddenly, the image returned, and on the screen it appeared. A massive circular structure, motionless, ancient, grooves stretched across its surface, straight, deliberate, unnatural. Then came the most chilling sight of all, a staircase, not rusted, not overgrown with algae, but clean, sharp. As if waiting, and then everything on the ship above began to fail. The electrical system shut down and rebooted on its own. Sonar glitched, lights dimmed. The crew stared at the monitors in silence. They didn't say a word. Because deep down they knew, this wasn't just a dive. They had just discovered something no one was supposed to find. To most, the Baltic anomaly was a shocking discovery, but to Ocean X, it was just the latest chapter in a long history of strange encounters. They weren't new to the unexplained. Back in 1992, Ocean X had made headlines across Europe when they discovered the wreck of a B-17 Flying Fortress, an American bomber that had vanished decades earlier. No one knew where it had gone down. And yet they found it, quiet, intact, resting on the seafloor like it had been placed there. Years later, they tracked down a sunken Swedish schooner lost in 1916, torpedoed by a German U-boat while carrying precious cargo. Over 3,000 bottles of champagne and 14 cases of fine cognac en route to Moscow's Metropole Hotel. When they finally found the wreck in 1997, everything was still sealed, the bottles perfectly preserved. But the real treasure was never the wine, it was the story, the hunt, the chase. Ocean X wasn't after gold. They weren't chasing glory. They were searching for the forgotten, for things the sea had chosen to keep. And that's what led them back to the Baltic in 2012. They returned to the site of the strange circle, not for fame, not for money, but because the mystery had left a mark on them. This time, they came prepared. Their ship was outfitted with next-generation sonar, reinforced ROVs, and specially shielded electronics. They believed they were ready. They were. Almost immediately, the interference began again. Every time they tried to lower equipment near the object, measuring tools, cameras, even basic lights, systems shut down. The moment an ROV entered the vicinity, it would lose power. Satellite connections failed without explanation. The ship's electrical grid flickered, scrambled, reset. It was as if the object was surrounded by an invisible barrier, something that didn't want to be touched. Frustrated but undeterred, the team turned to the oldest tool they had left. Human eyes. They suited up their best divers. No tech, no digital sensors, just handheld cameras and pure nerve. And as the divers descended into the blackness, they were about to witness something no machine could have shown them. Because what lay beneath wasn't just strange, it was impossible. Descending into the Baltic Sea is not for the faint of heart. The water is bitterly cold, near freezing even in summer. Light vanishes after a few dozen feet. Sound fades. The deeper you go, the more it feels like you're leaving the world behind. And on that day in 2012, the divers of Ocean X weren't just descending into darkness, they were entering the unknown. Without the use of sophisticated tech, no live sonar, no remotely operated vehicles, they carried only basic lights, handheld cameras, and their instincts. As they moved closer to the coordinates, an eerie stillness began to settle over the site. Not even the usual signs of marine life. No fish, no movement, not even algae were present. It was as if this place had been untouched for centuries, maybe longer. Then, through the haze, it emerged. A massive structure, more than 60 meters across, rose from the seafloor like a forgotten monument. Unlike coral reefs or shipwrecks, which often appear jagged or broken, this object had edges, angles, symmetry. It looked designed. As they circled closer, the details became clearer. Grooves, deep, straight, and unnaturally precise, ran along its surface like channels or seams. These weren't fractures caused by pressure or time. They were too clean, too uniform. As if they had been carved, and then the holes, perfectly round and spaced apart at regular intervals. The divers measured them with their hands. They were nearly identical in diameter, drilled straight through the stone. Some lined up along the surface like anchor points. Others led inward, suggesting an internal structure hidden beneath the crust. To anyone familiar with nature's patterns, it was obvious this wasn't erosion. It wasn't geological randomness. It was engineered. They moved to the center of the formation. That's when they saw it, a dome, rising up from the base like a cockpit or observation tower. Its shape was smooth and almost aerodynamic. Cracks ran along the surface, but even those looked too clean to be accidents. It reminded some of the divers of the turrets on old submarines or the bridge of a spacecraft. Then came the most chilling discovery of all, a staircase. Yes, an actual stone staircase, descending from one tier of the structure to a lower level. The steps were evenly spaced, each one the same height and depth. No coral, no decay, no signs of age. It was as if no time had touched them at all. One diver described the feeling as walking into a ruin that didn't want to be remembered. Another said it looked like something left behind, not by nature, not by war, but by something that had lived and then left. As they continued their survey, more shapes began to appear from the murk. Rectangular stone blocks, upright pillars, flat walkways half buried in sediment, and narrow corridors, almost like alleys, leading outward from the main body into the seafloor itself. It wasn't just a shape, it was a site, a place, a layout. Some began whispering words like temple or base. Others stayed silent, too overwhelmed by what they were seeing to label it with any word they knew. But one thing was absolutely clear: this wasn't random. This wasn't natural. It had purpose, and it had been hidden undisturbed for who knows how long. And yet, despite the clarity of what their eyes saw, not a single diver could say with confidence what it really was. A ruin, a spacecraft, a monument. All they knew was that they had looked at something no human was ever meant to see. After the dive, the Ocean X team returned to the surface shaken, but determined. Before leaving the site, they had managed to collect a few small fragments from the object's outer surface. At first glance, the pieces looked unremarkable, rough, dull, gray. They could have been mistaken for any ordinary seafloor debris, but what these fragments revealed would only deepen the mystery. The samples were sent to Stockholm University for analysis. The results came back quickly. The rock was basalt, an igneous stone typically formed by volcanic activity. That's when the confusion started. Because the section of the Baltic Sea where the object was found has no known history of volcanic activity. Not recently, not even within the past million years. In fact, geologists believe there hasn't been significant volcanic action in that region since the Precambrian era, a time more than 1 billion years ago, long before complex life had even emerged on Earth. So how did volcanic rock end up in such a cold, geologically quiet place? Had it been transported there by glacial movement across ancient ice sheets? Maybe. But glacial forces tend to leave behind scratched, broken rocks, not smooth, machined surfaces with symmetrical grooves and perfect holes. And then there was the second anomaly. Tests showed no traces of metal, no iron, no steel, no synthetic materials, nothing that would indicate this was part of a sunken ship, a submarine, or any known human-made structure. It was quite literally just rock, and yet it had been shaped, designed. The more experts studied the sample, the less sense it made. If it was natural, it had been sculpted by forces no one could explain. If it was artificial, it had been made by hands or tools long before recorded history. The idea of a volcanic stone sculpture, resting in perfect form hundreds of feet beneath the Baltic Sea, was as absurd as it was undeniable. Even the object's location made little sense. It wasn't on a slope or lodged between tectonic ridges. It rested in isolation, like it had been placed there. This raised an even stranger possibility. What if the object hadn't formed there at all? What if it had been brought deliberately, transported across a now vanished landscape, or even dropped from above? But by who and why? These questions, rooted in science, quickly spiraled into something deeper. Because if this object didn't belong to the natural world, then maybe it never belonged to this world at all. When the first images of the object began circulating online, it didn't take long for the world to react. Speculation exploded, and as always, when science falls silent, imagination begins to speak. The most sensational theory, the one that captivated the public almost instantly, was this. It was a UFO, a spacecraft, crashed thousands of years ago, now buried beneath the Baltic Sea. At first, the idea seemed far-fetched, but the details were almost too perfect. A massive, perfectly circular object, a 300-meter trench carved into the seafloor behind it, like a skid mark from an emergency landing. A central dome rising like a cockpit, surrounding electromagnetic interference strong enough to disable sonar, compasses, and even electrical systems on board the Ocean X ship. Some believers went further, calling it a long-lost Arctic Roswell, a relic of ancient extraterrestrial visitation, hidden in plain sight. But not everyone was convinced by the alien theory. Others looked backward, not to the stars, but to the depths of time. According to them, the structure wasn't from another planet. It was from a forgotten civilization, Atlantis. Or perhaps even Mu, a mythical continent said to have sunk beneath the ocean. They pointed to the object's stone staircase, the carved slabs, the geometric symmetry, all reminiscent of ceremonial temples found in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Central America. What if this was a spiritual site, a sacred platform built when sea levels were lower, before history began recording its own past, then slowly, over centuries, buried by water, time, and silence? Could this be the first physical evidence of a pre-flood civilization we've only read about in myth? But the mystery didn't stop there. A third theory emerged, one not from legend, but from history's darkest chapters: Nazi Germany. During World War II, The Nazis were notorious for their obsession with superweapons and experimental technology. Some researchers suggested that the object could be a sunken communications base or a prototype electromagnetic weapon, part of a secret military program. If the grooves were internal corridors and the dome a command center, then maybe this wasn't ancient at all. Maybe it was a relic of a war fought not just on land and sky, but beneath the sea. A project lost or buried on purpose. But as these ideas began to spread across documentaries, blogs, and conspiracy forums, a quieter voice began to rise, the voice of skepticism. Could all of this, every photo, every theory, be the result of one enormous misunderstanding? According to some geologists, yes. They proposed that what Ocean X had found wasn't a spaceship, or a ruin, or a weapon, but simply a glacial deposit, a natural formation left behind by ancient ice sheets, sculpted over tens of thousands of years by pressure, erosion, and coincidence. What looked like staircases were just layered stone. What seemed like drill holes were hollow pockets formed by trapped gas or mineral erosion. What appeared as intention was just illusion. Some even went further, suggesting that the low-resolution sonar images had exaggerated the structure's features, turning an ordinary rock into an extraordinary hoax. Not deliberate fraud, just the perfect storm of speculation, visual pareidolia, and digital projection. And yet, despite all these explanations, something still doesn't add up. Because no matter how logical the counterarguments sound, they all share one fatal flaw. None of them can explain why modern technology continues to fail around the object, why magnetic fields spike, why signals die, why even today no one has been able to fully map, measure, or retrieve it. It's as if the Baltic anomaly doesn't just resist understanding, it actively defends itself from it. More than a decade has passed since the Ocean X team first saw that impossible shape glowing faintly on their sonar screen. In all the years since, no single theory, scientific or speculative, has managed to close the case. It could be a natural formation, shaped by glaciers and chance. It could be the remains of a forgotten civilization. It could be something from the stars, or it could be nothing at all. But here's the strange truth. In a world obsessed with answers, perhaps the most unsettling thing is a question that refuses to be answered. Because this isn't just about a rock, it's about the way it makes us feel, that cold shiver in the gut. That moment of silence after the lights flicker, that quiet voice that says, "Something is down there, and it's not done with us yet." We live in an age where information is immediate, where mysteries are dissected and solved before they can even take root. But not this one. This one resists, and maybe that's why it matters so much, not because we know what it is, but because deep down we don't, and that tiny crack in our certainty, that sliver of not knowing. That's where wonder lives. That's where awe begins. That's where the questions grow. So until the day we return to the bottom of the Baltic Sea, until someone finally dares to dig deeper, the anomaly will remain where it always has, hidden, watching, waiting.